unimaginably cruel medical experiments that were conducted on the prisoners here at Dachau.
Cannot be made real by burning people, said Heinrich Heine 100 years earlier.
At the infamous Dachau concentration camp, a Nazi doctor carried out horrific experiments, deliberately infecting over 1,000 innocent prisoners with deadly parasites, subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. His actions, a devastating example of human cruelty, would ultimately lead to his capture and the face of justice. Join us as we dive into the chilling story of the execution of the Nazi doctor who killed 1,000 people at Dachau. Claus Schilling, pioneer in tropical medicine. Born on July 5, 1871, in Munich, Germany, Claus Schilling emerged as a prominent figure in tropical medicine and parasitology. After earning his medical degree in 1895, Schilling quickly rose to prominence in his field, becoming a professor at the University of Berlin. His groundbreaking research on tropical diseases, particularly malaria, earned him a place on the Malaria Commission of the League of Nations. Schilling dedicated himself to combating malaria and other tropical diseases, focusing much of his early career on advancing public health in German colonial territories in Africa. In 1905, Schilling became the first director of the Tropical Medicine Division at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, one of Germany's foremost medical research institutions. For the next 3 decades, he led significant efforts to understand and control malaria, a disease that posed a major threat to global health. Under Schilling's leadership, the institute became an important hub for research into infectious diseases. His contributions to parasitology were widely recognized, and he gained international acclaim for his work. However, Schilling's legacy is overshadowed by the darker chapters of his career, which reflect the troubling intersections of science, politics, and morality. The Robert Koch Institute itself became a case study of how scientific institutions can be reshaped by ideology. When the Nazi regime came to power in 1933, the institute underwent significant changes. Although its directors and group leaders were initially retained, Jewish scientists and researchers were systematically dismissed, leaving a void in the institute's intellectual community. The Nazi government restructured the institute, aligning its research priorities with the regime's militaristic and ideological goals. Schilling, who retired from the institute in 1936, would later find himself deeply entangled in this ideological shift. After his retirement, Schilling relocated to fascist Italy, where he continued his research under Benito Mussolini's regime. In Italy, Schilling conducted controversial experiments on human subjects, a stark departure from the ethical boundaries of his earlier work. With financial support from Nazi Germany, Schilling carried out malaria immunization experiments on inmates in psychiatric asylums in Volterra and San Nicolo di Siena. These experiments were intended to develop strategies to combat malaria outbreaks among Italian troops during the Italo-Ethiopian War. The work was strategically important, and Schilling's research was viewed as a valuable asset to both Italian and German military interests. The methods Schilling employed in these experiments were ethically indefensible. Vulnerable individuals, confined to psychiatric institutions and unable to give consent, were deliberately infected with malaria as part of his research. These actions represented a profound violation of medical ethics, transforming Schilling from a respected scientist into a symbol of the dark consequences of unregulated scientific experimentation. However, the experiments Schilling conducted at the Robert Koch Institute pale in comparison to the atrocities he unleashed at the Dachau concentration camp. The Dachau concentration camp. The Dachau concentration camp, established on March 22, 1933, became one of the earliest and most notorious symbols of Nazi terror. Located on the grounds of a disused gunpowder and munitions factory, Dachau was initially created to imprison political opponents of Adolf Hitler's regime. Over time, it transformed into a model for the brutal system of persecution and extermination that defined the Nazi era. Its methods of operation set the precedent for the sprawling network of camps that would spread across Europe, serving as both a training ground for SS personnel and a proving ground for the horrors of Nazi ideology. The opening of Dachau closely followed Adolf Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, marking the beginning of the Nazis' consolidation of power. The regime acted swiftly to eliminate all forms of opposition, targeting communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other dissenting voices. Concentration camps became a central tool in this campaign, detaining individuals who were seen as threats to Nazi control. Dachau, the first camp of its kind, symbolized the regime's capacity for organized brutality and became a prototype for subsequent facilities of terror. Under the command of Theodor Eicke, Dachau was transformed into a laboratory for Nazi repression. In October 1933, Eicke implemented a rigid system of rules that codified the dominance of the SS over prisoners. Violence, torture, and murder were institutionalized, with Eicke's guidelines encouraging unchecked cruelty. This system, often referred to as the Dachau model, became the standard for all Nazi concentration camps. The camp's efficiency in controlling and dehumanizing inmates showcased the potential for using such facilities as tools of terror. The camp's growing importance became evident in 1934 during the Night of the Long Knives. Under orders from Hitler, the SS executed political opponents and high-ranking SA officials within Dachau. This event not only solidified the SS's role as a dominant force within the Nazi hierarchy, but also demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of the Dachau model. These events marked the camp as a key instrument of Nazi political repression. Originally intended for political prisoners, Dachau's purpose expanded over time. By 1935, Adolf Hitler had decided to utilize the concentration camp system as a permanent mechanism of political terror. This decision broadened the scope of imprisonment to include those targeted for racial, social, and ideological reasons. Jews, Roma, Sinti, other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime were sent to Dachau, where they faced brutal conditions and systematic abuse. The camp became a symbol of the Nazis' commitment to enforcing their twisted ideals of racial purity and social control. In 1937, Dachau underwent significant expansion. Prisoners were forced to build a new camp designed to accommodate over 6,000 inmates. The labor was grueling, carried out under inhumane conditions that reflected the regime's policy of extermination through work.
The camp is hunger personified. The hunger is in us, deep.
Meanwhile, the Nazi regime implemented policies targeting so-called asocial elements and professional criminals, leading to mass arrests and a dramatic increase in the camp's population. By 1939, the regime's racial ideology took center stage. Following the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, thousands of Jewish men, Roma and Sinti, were deported to Dachau. The aftermath of the November pogroms, also known as Kristallnacht, brought over 11,000 Jewish men to the camp. These individuals were brutally beaten and coerced into relinquishing their property and possessions, underscoring the camp's role as both a tool of persecution and a mechanism of economic exploitation. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 marked a turning point for Dachau. The camp became a hub for prisoners from across Nazi-occupied Europe, including political dissidents, resistance fighters, and intellectuals. Living conditions, already deplorable, worsened as the camp became overcrowded. Starvation, forced labor, and disease turned Dachau into a death trap. Prisoners were subjected to backbreaking work under constant threat of violence, their survival hinging on luck and sheer resilience. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 brought even greater horrors to Dachau. The camp became an execution site for thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. Members of the Red Army, identified as intellectuals, Jews, or communist officials, were segregated and systematically executed by the SS.
6 million Jews, 6 million human beings murdered.
These mass killings initially took place in the bunker courtyard, but were later moved to the SS shooting range at Herbertshausen. Between 1941 and 1942, over 4,000 Soviet POWs were murdered at Dachau, a grim testament to the camp's role in the Nazis' genocidal agenda. Malaria, experiments in hell. In 1942, Claus Schilling was provided with a special malaria research station at Dachau concentration camp by Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. Over the following years, this facility became the site of some of the most inhumane medical experiments carried out during the Nazi regime. Despite Schilling's claims that his research could be conducted harmlessly, the reality was far different. Prisoners at Dachau were subjected to deliberate infection with malaria parasites and endured unimaginable suffering as part of Schilling's relentless pursuit of a vaccine. Test subjects were often confined with their hands and arms in cages filled with malaria-infected mosquitoes, ensuring they contracted the disease. Others were injected with blood containing malaria parasites. Once infected, they faced the full brunt of malaria's debilitating symptoms: crippling fevers, relentless chills, severe headaches, and profound weakness. Many of the prisoners, already emaciated and weakened by the camp's brutal conditions, were quickly overwhelmed by the disease. The treatment phase of Schilling's experiments was no less brutal. Infected prisoners were administered synthetic anti-malaria drugs in doses ranging from high to lethal. These drugs, still experimental and untested on humans, often caused violent side effects, including convulsions, vomiting, severe pain, and organ failure. Many of the test subjects succumbed to the toxic effects of the treatments, rather than the disease itself. For Schilling, these men and women were expendable tools in his experiments, their suffering and deaths merely collateral damage in his pursuit of scientific progress. The toll of Schilling's experiments was catastrophic. Of the more than 1,000 prisoners used as test subjects, between 300 and 400 died directly as a result of the experiments. Among the survivors, many were left permanently injured, suffering from chronic pain, organ damage, and debilitating health issues that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Schilling's victims included prisoners from various backgrounds, and among them were a significant number of priests imprisoned by the Nazis. Some of these clergy members were killed during the experiments, and their faith and resilience were no shield against the horrors inflicted upon them. Although Schilling presented his work as vital to combating malaria, the methods he employed revealed a disturbing sadism. The suffering of his subjects was not a byproduct of scientific exploration, it was integral to the process. The research station at Dachau became a chamber of horrors, where human lives were systematically destroyed under the pretense of advancing medical science. The horrifying legacy of Schilling's experiments set the stage for a wider reckoning with the atrocities of the Nazi regime. His trial would become one of the first major steps toward establishing international accountability for war crimes. A turning point in post-war justice. Dr. Claus Schilling's trial was a critical moment in the aftermath of World War II, representing not just a reckoning for individual atrocities, but also a defining step in the establishment of international justice. tried in the Dachau Trials, specifically in the case the United States versus Martin Gottfried Weiss, Wilhelm Rupert et al.
In Dachau wurde im Verlauf des Prozesses gegen das Personal des Konzentrationslagers Buchenwald
Schilling stood among 40 defendants, including doctors and staff, accused of war crimes at Dachau concentration camp and its satellite camps. The Dachau trials were initiated by the United States Army in November 1945, shortly after the camp's liberation, and were among the first mass trials addressing Nazi war crimes. These trials were grounded in a newly developed legal framework, built to address the unprecedented scale and scope of the crimes uncovered in the Holocaust. The primary basis for the proceedings was Directive JCS 1023/10, issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in July 1945. This directive empowered General Dwight D. Eisenhower as the American Commander-in-Chief in occupied Germany to conduct military court trials for individuals accused of war crimes in territories under U.S. control. The directive specified the jurisdiction of these courts and defined war crimes as violations of the customs and laws of war. The charges brought against Schilling and his co-defendants were categorized under this broad definition, focusing on their roles in a common design to mistreat and murder Allied civilians and prisoners of war. While the horrors of the Nazi regime affected millions, the initial scope of these trials was limited to crimes committed against citizens of the Allied nations. Offenses against German nationals were generally deferred to German courts for later prosecution. Schilling's indictment, along with those of his co-accused, was drawn up on November 2nd, 1945, and detailed two main charges under the umbrella of war crimes. The defendants were accused of unlawfully and intentionally participating in the abuse, exploitation, and killing of Allied nationals and prisoners of war. Their actions were framed not as isolated incidents, but as part of a coordinated and systematic effort to violate international norms and human rights. Specific acts of brutality, referred to as excess deeds, were attributed to individual defendants, including Schilling. These acts served as evidence of the deliberate cruelty carried out within Dachau's walls. The trial unfolded like a grim revelation of humanity's darkest deeds. Among the 139 pieces of evidence submitted were 60 haunting photographs, the chilling death books from 1941 and 1942, damning documents, and the defendants' own testimonies. Standing in court were 69 prosecution witnesses, including former prisoners who had survived the nightmare and U.S. Army officers who had witnessed its brutal conclusion. These officers testified to the horrors uncovered during the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, recounting the ghastly sight of bodies in the evacuation train from Buchenwald and the appalling conditions in the camp itself. Survivors painted a vivid and harrowing picture of life in the camp. They spoke of inhumane conditions, inadequate clothing, starvation-level nutrition, overcrowded barracks, grueling forced labor, rampant epidemics, horrific medical experiments, merciless selections, brutal executions, and constant mistreatment. Beyond the main camp, the testimony extended to the equally catastrophic conditions in its satellite camps, where suffering continued unabated. The defense attempted to counter these allegations with 93 witnesses, including the accused themselves, and 27 pieces of evidence. Both sides engaged in intense cross-examinations. Defendants, particularly the camp staff, were charged with heinous acts, mistreating and murdering prisoners, conducting executions, and facilitating the appalling evacuation process. Medical personnel were accused of even darker crimes, such as declaring the deaths of executed prisoners, selecting victims for medical experiments, and participating in their torture and deaths. The commandant's staff faced accusations of bearing ultimate responsibility for the camp's catastrophic conditions, enabling the system of mass murder and suffering. Even prisoner functionaries were implicated, with 2 accused of actively mistreating and killing fellow prisoners, and a 3rd charged with assisting in executions. Despite overwhelming evidence, the defendants sought to downplay their roles. They claimed obedience to orders or outright denied their presence at the scenes of atrocities. Yet the weight of the evidence, stark photographs, heart-wrenching testimonies, and detailed records spoke louder than their denials. The trial was not just a courtroom battle, but a moral reckoning, laying bare the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of those who survived to tell the world. Among the accused, one defendant's case stood out for its stark contrast in both age and defense strategy. His testimony offered a chilling glimpse into the rationalizations of those who claimed to pursue science amidst unimaginable atrocities. Claus Schilling on trial. Claus Schilling, at the age of 74, stood out as the oldest defendant in the trial. Unlike many others on trial, Schilling was neither a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party nor the SS. Schilling did not shy away from admitting that his experiments took place. He defended his actions by claiming that the suffering inflicted upon the prisoners was for the advancement of science. He argued that his research was essential to understanding malaria and developing a vaccine, and therefore it should be allowed to continue and be fully documented. Furthermore, he distanced himself from the operations within the camp itself, claiming that his role was strictly scientific and had no direct connection to the atrocities of the camp. However, his defense did not hold up in the military court, which rejected his justifications outright. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Denson, was firm in its stance against Schilling and other defendants. Denson argued that the crimes committed at Dachau represented a continuous and systematic violation of human rights, and all accused individuals, through their involvement in the functioning of the camp system, bore responsibility. He pointed out that even the SS-appointed capos, who oversaw operations in the camp, shared in this culpability. Denson rejected the defense's plea of Befehl's not stand, the claim that following orders exempted individuals from responsibility, asserting that blind obedience could not erase their role in the crimes. His final argument was clear. No mitigating circumstances existed, and justice would require harsh sentences to ensure accountability. On the other side, the defense lawyers were aggressive in their counter-arguments. They criticized the notion of common design, arguing that it was a legal concept outside the bounds of European legal traditions. They maintained that this concept had been applied to the defendants unfairly and arbitrarily. Their defense pointed to the lack of direct evidence of individual culpability, which had made the trial possible only through this legal theory. They brought up specific instances to strengthen their case, such as testimony from witnesses suggesting that the conditions in Dachau had improved under the leadership of former camp commander Weiss. The defense team also raised concerns about the reliability of witness testimony, claiming that some false statements had been presented during the trial. They added that certain defendants had been forced into service at Dachau and should not be held fully accountable. In their conclusion, the defense lawyers asserted that the real responsibility lay with the primary architects of the war crimes being prosecuted, who were being tried in the Nuremberg trial, not in the Dachau proceedings. They alleged that this trial was motivated not by a quest for justice, but by a desire for revenge. The arguments of both the prosecution and defense highlighted the complexity of the Dachau camp trial, where issues of morality, responsibility, and legal precedent clashed. While Schilling defended his experiments as noble scientific work, The court's rejection of his claims reflected the overwhelming sense of accountability demanded by the horrifying realities of Dachau and the Nazi war machine. The verdict marked a decisive moment in the trial, bringing the court's stance on accountability and justice into sharp focus. What followed was a controversial chapter that would continue to provoke debate long after the sentence was carried out. Justice at the gallows. On December 13, 1945, the tribunal sentenced Schilling to death by hanging, acknowledging the profound cruelty and moral depravity of his actions. Schilling's demeanor after his sentencing remained remarkably composed. In a telling decision, he instructed his lawyer not to appeal the sentence, expressing a preference for death over life in prison. This choice, whether a reflection of defiance or resignation, added another layer of complexity to his character. In the months following the trial, Schilling's case sparked heated debate in the German medical community. Some colleagues portrayed him as a dedicated and humane scientist whose work had been misunderstood or exaggerated. They argued that his research, despite its horrifying methods, was driven by a genuine desire to advance medical knowledge. These protests, however, failed to sway the Allied authorities, who upheld the sentence, viewing Schilling as emblematic of the perversion of science under Nazi rule. On May 28, 1946, Schilling was executed at Landsberg prison in Landsberg am Lech. Military personnel documented the execution, capturing the stark finality of his ascent to the gallows. Moments before his hanging, when asked if he had any last words, Schilling maintained his defiant posture, declaring, "I am not guilty. Please get it over with." Schilling's case remains a haunting study of how ambition and ideology can corrupt even the most ostensibly noble professions. His conviction and execution served as a pivotal moment in the post-war reckoning, reinforcing the message that no profession, however esteemed, is above accountability when it comes to crimes against humanity. Schilling's execution marked a turning point in the post-war reckoning, but his story is just one part of a larger, troubling narrative. The broader history of the Robert Koch Institute reveals how scientific research became entangled with Nazi ideology and crimes. Schilling's dark legacy. Schilling's story is intertwined with the broader history of the Robert Koch Institute during the Nazi era. Recent historical investigations, such as Annette Hinz-Wessel's Das Robert Koch Institut im Nationalsozialismus, have shed light on the Institute's complicity in the Nazi regime's agenda. The book provides a detailed examination of how the Robert Koch Institute aligned its research with the regime's ideological goals, discarding its long-standing commitment to scientific neutrality in favor of political conformity. This alignment came at a horrifying human cost, as the Institute dismissed Jewish scientists and adopted research methods that disregarded human rights, often in pursuit of Nazi goals. The dismissal of many scientists during this time remains a dark chapter, their fates still largely unknown, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of surrendering scientific integrity to political pressure. The Robert Koch Institute's association with figures like Dr. Claus Schilling and his successors reflects this troubling period. Schilling's name has become infamous due to his role in the inhumane experiments carried out at Dachau and his prosecution in the aftermath of World War II. His actions and those of his successors highlight how scientific research became entangled with the regime's war crimes, ultimately leading to systematic violations of ethics, medical practices, and human rights. After Schilling retired as leader of the group of scientists at the Robert Koch Institute, Dr. Hans Rose took over his position. Rose was a seasoned researcher with extensive experience, having previously worked in China and specializing in research on typhus. Under his leadership, The group continued to engage in unethical research practices by using concentration camp prisoners as subjects for medical experiments. Just as Schilling had done before him, Rose's actions were rooted in the pursuit of scientific discovery, but at the expense of human suffering and death. His research and leadership cemented his role in the systematic abuse carried out by the Institute under Nazi rule. Rose was later convicted at the Nuremberg trials after the war ended. The tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment in 1945, although his time in prison did not mark the end of his scientific journey. In 1955, Rose was released from prison, and his life took an unexpected turn. By 1962, he had successfully reintegrated into the scientific community as a member of the Max Planck Society, one of Germany's most respected research institutions. This transition from his role as a Nazi researcher to a member of such a prestigious scientific body illustrates the complex post-war reintegration of individuals implicated in Nazi crimes. Another scientist associated with this dark period was Dr. Haan, a prominent virologist whose role in Nazi crimes highlights the scope of medical experimentation during the war. Haan was convicted by a French court for his participation in experiments conducted in a concentration camp in Alsace, located in what is now eastern France. His experiments, which subjected prisoners to virological testing, resulted in numerous deaths and immense suffering. Despite his conviction, Haan was released from prison after a short period. Following his release, he returned to Germany and joined a virology laboratory in Tübingen, where he continued his research. He also received financial support from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft (DFG), Germany's main research funding body, in 1957. Hagen's chilling actions are reflected in a letter he sent to Hans Rose in August 1943, in which he stated that he had contacted the Central Office of the SS to ensure access to sufficient human material from worthless lives for our purpose. This letter is a stark reminder of the inhumanity of these experiments and the deliberate use of concentration camp prisoners as research subjects without consent. Schilling, Rose, and Haan are widely considered some of the most infamous scientists involved in Nazi medical crimes. Their actions represent some of the most horrible examples of scientific research corrupted by ambition, political ideologies, and a complete disregard for ethical responsibility. Though their crimes have been widely studied, recent research continues to uncover new details about their actions and the broader context of their experiments. These scientists serve as cautionary figures in history, illustrating the consequences of allowing scientific progress to proceed unchecked and without moral accountability.